Well, let's get another point of view on all this now. I can talk live to James Denslow, a writer on Middle East policy and security from King's College, London. Many thanks for joining us, Mr. Denslow, here on RT. Now, it was hoped that calm would be restored after Mubarak said he wouldn't be standing for re-election in September, but then we saw strong pro-Mubarak rallies and further violence on the streets of Cairo. Do you think we're going to see any further such clashes, or will peace now be restored to the streets?
Well, it's a very tense situation, and clearly there's every prospect of violence. There's armed gangs on the streets, the army is out in force, you have American-made tanks rolling around central Cairo. What I would say is that previous to Mubarak's announcement, the entire situation was like a game of chess, and one move would be made by the opposition and a counter move would be made by Mubarak. And it seems on this occasion he made two moves at once. He announced that he would not be standing in the elections later this year, and at the same time he unleashed members of his own security forces in mufti, so much like sort of looters for hire. And what that did was sort of essentially crystallise what was apparently a sort of peaceful revolution uniting the country into a far more complex one that reflects how entrenched the regime is. And that, of course, remains the reality as we speak today.
And unrest has been spreading throughout the wider region, hasn't it? Are we seeing the formation, do you think, of a different sort of Middle East?
Well, I think the Middle East won't be the same after these actions occur. I mean, certainly whether Egypt goes to sort of being a military regime light rather than the Mubarak style, or if it opens up into the Arab world's most populous country and its biggest democracy, we will see. But certainly what's happened so far is unprecedented. Whether it's what happened in Tunisia, the fact that Algeria's state of emergency has disappeared, events in Yemen, Jordan's government falling. So far it has been an incredible wave of action from the people without any sort of form of external support, and it makes you look back at what happened in 2003 and the American sponsoring of an invasion and the toppling of Saddam Hussein, and wondering whether actually it could have been done far better by the people themselves. I think it's an incredible coincidence of two new factors in particular that have aided this. Not only is it the moribund state of these countries' economies, its large youth unemployment, it's also the fact that you have a huge amount of transparency coming out through WikiLeaks and social networking and internet tools, allowing people to organise and sort of subvert the traditional obstacles that a police state prevents to stop them essentially participating in their own country's affairs.
Now, Washington openly says that it is negotiating President Mubarak's departure from office, calling for a quick transition for free and fair elections. But do you think it's likely to be seen as further meddling by the US?
Well, I think that no one will ever think that the US is a neutral arbitrator in this affair. I mean, clearly it's got a huge amount of vested interest in Egypt. Egypt is the location of the second amount of US military assistance in recent history. So the US is not under any illusions of its role and its relationship with the country. And, of course, it's supported the Mubarak regime for decades. I think that the Obama administration's response was characterized by extreme amounts of fence-sitting. And I think it's only come to this point where clearly the population of Egypt has totally and utterly rejected Mubarak and his regime, that they decided to take action. Now, this of course brings us to the next question, is that how deep will this change go? The population of Egypt have clearly shown again that they won't accept Mubarak staying for even a few more months. So what happens next? Because his regime is far more than him. And of course the cronyism and the Praetorian Guard system that he essentially built in the country will remain. The politics of that will remain too, unless there is a significant alteration of the constitution and the politics of Egypt. And that, of course, remains to be seen whether the Americans support that level, because, of course, it's instability that's associated with such an incredible change in such a large country.
Well, let's look forward to the future. If Mubarak does heed to the demands from the people on the streets and does step down, who or what will fill the void? If radical groups do gain some sort of political power, could that possibly result in parts of the Middle East uniting against the West?
Well, I think your question needs to be slightly repositioned. The reason that there were such things as radical groups in Egypt was because more traditional, legitimate groups weren't allowed. They were banned, which is the reason why the regime ran the country as it did. It didn't allow for an effective and open opposition. So if the politics of the country significantly change, and we see a period of time in which parties are allowed to articulate the concerns of normal Egyptians, then I think we're far more likely to see a mode of politics that everyone can actually agree on, rather than focusing on this fear-mongering about Islamic extremism, where, of course, it's an issue across the world, just as other forms of religious extremism are, but I don't think it characterises the only other option to Mubarak's rule, which is the story that he's trying to peddle himself. He says that he'd love to leave the country, but he can't for its own stability. Yet it is he who is unleashing armed gangs on the street, who are throwing Molotov cocktails at people and shooting people. So I think he's ultimately trying to answer his own question, which is not fair for the people of Egypt.
Well, looking at one particular faction which could potentially gain power as a result of all of this, the Muslim Brotherhood, it says that it will take steps to ensure a peace treaty with Israel is actually cancelled if it does gain power. Is this likely to happen, do you think? And should Israel be concerned about what's happening outside of its borders over in Egypt?
Well, Israel is most definitely concerned, and I think there's no doubt about that. I think it's a bit too far ahead to say what exact role the Muslim Brotherhood will have in any future coalition or political structure in Egypt. I think it's interesting to look at what happened in 1979 in the Iranian Revolution, whereby a popular revolution that comprised of several more factors than simply Islamists took power, but it was the Islamists that were able to consolidate power following the revolution. So the Muslim Brotherhood clearly have a structure of control that has allowed themselves to continually exist under the pressures of the Mubarak regime. That will give them a huge amount of strength going into whatever happens next. But it really does come down to the idea of what other groups will be able to speak up for themselves and organise. Now, the whole of this peaceful protest so far, I think, has reflected a very innate groundswell of ability to organise. So I think there's no guarantee that the Muslim Brotherhood will simply dominate the politics of post-Mubarak era.
James Denslow from King's College London, many thanks for speaking to us.